Kimi K3, biggest release of the year or the biggest overreaction since DeepSeek?
I mean, biggest release of the year. It's the first time that we're really seeing a true piece of evidence against the distillation narrative. In other words, it's the first time that a Chinese model is really exceeding the performance of even the top frontier American models. And that cannot be done simply through distillation. Maybe distillation is a part of the story, but there's also a part of the story that goes beyond distillation. In other words, real scientific innovation by the Chinese labs, which is a huge challenge to the narrative of American hegemony in AI.
You posted that Kimi K3 beat Fable on Code Arena just 6 weeks after the big Fable release. What did you think when you first saw the votes coming in?
Oh, I mean, it was incredible to see. We almost didn't believe our eyes. The first thing we did was check to make sure that the integrity of the leaderboard was correct. And indeed it was, that all this was real people voting on their real workflows. I mean, it's been replicated, and it's been consistent. And in fact, if you look at the leaderboard today, the effect of the votes is actually statistically significant in the sense that there's a statistically significant measurable difference between Kimi and Fable that persists to this day. And Code Arena is not the only place where it's number one. You can also see it number one on Agent Arena under the task completion leaderboard. And so users are seeing their tasks getting completed at faster and faster rates, and more and higher rates by Kimi, of course, an open source Chinese model, than they are even by Fable, which was a mythologized model released by Anthropic.
1,679 points. That's a 17-place jump from K to 6. Have you ever seen a single generation leap like that on the leaderboard?
Well, to be fair, Kimi K2.5 came quite a long time ago. And so a lot of other labs are doing more progressive releases. I will say that we have seen larger gaps between the number one model and the number two model in Arena history, namely GPT Image 2, which was crushing the competition at the time that it was released. Basically, when it was released, it was winning at a 90% win rate over every other model, which is unheard of because you basically can't get two humans to agree on anything ever. And, with more than a 60% agreement rate. So the fact that it was 90% meant that that was like one of the largest improvements in AI that we've ever seen in the entire, history of the space. I would not consider this to be that large of an improvement, but what makes it such a tectonic shift is that it's coming from an open source Chinese model, as opposed to the closed source American labs that have been in the lead basically since the beginning.
Number one in 6 of 7 front-end domains, but it's still number 2 in gaming behind Fable. What does that gaming gap tell you?
What that tells you is that users that are coming to Arena and building their games on top of Arena are still having a better experience with Fable than with Kimi. Now, that could be just due to some, random noise fluctuations in the estimation of the score, but it could also be a real effect. And it just goes to show that model performance is heterogeneous. That just because a model is doing well in one area does not necessarily mean it's doing well in another. But still, overall, if you're looking in aggregate overall, coding and web development prompts, Kimi K3 is still number one.
Right. You said this marks the moment open source Chinese models surpassed US models. In your opinion, is this a permanent shift or just a snapshot?
Well, nothing is permanent in the world of AI. The leaderboards are shifting every week at this point with, in the last 10 days, we've had 5 model releases. So I have no doubt that the American labs are still in the running. But it does mean that there is a thriving scientific ecosystem in China that we really need to take seriously. In fact, what I expect to happen, and I predicted this online, is that American labs will start distilling Chinese intelligence and instead of the other way around, which has been the dominant narrative. You've already seen this with Inkling that's building their model on Kimi K 2.5, with Cursor that did the same thing. And there's a reason why these companies are doing this. It's because open source models are such a powerful value proposition. Why would you build your business on top of a model that you can't control, where you have to send all of your data to a third-party service? That's why open source is so powerful. And, we should all be looking to American labs to be developing American open source models as well as Chinese so that, both sides of the Pacific have their dogs in the race. The US is considering regulating the use of Chinese models. The Chinese are also considering export controls on US models. Where is going? What's the right way of regulating this ecosystem, if at all? The Chinese have already had import controls on US models. You cannot actually serve as a US company, US models in China. There's already some degree of regulation and precedent there to build on top of. And then you have to think about how you're going to act as China and as the US. In China, yeah, you can regulate the export of your models to the US, but then what are you doing you are missing out on the revenue that you'd get from the Western market. So it's unclear whether that is actually a pro con for them, whether they want to have models just domestically, internally, or, perhaps globally, but not in the West. They're missing out on the biggest market. Doesn't make sense to me, but we'll see from the national security perspective whether they think that's the right thing to do. And then on the other hand, in the American ecosystem, there's pros and cons to regulating these Chinese models. On the con side, against regulation, why would you cripple American businesses? American businesses shouldn't be building on closed source models for the rest of eternity. They should be owning their intelligence. They should have sovereignty. And that's what the word that people are using for it these days, so that they have control over their destiny and they don't get Fable shut off either because Anthropic doesn't want them using Fable or because the US government regulates it. That's the only type of certainty that's the type of certainty that you need when you are running a real business at scale. And so that's what people are seeing. And by crippling these businesses, we'll be letting the Chinese advance faster. So why would we do that? We should just be investing in the American open source to give ourselves a better alternative. That would be the argument in the con. And then on the pro, we've seen many, many times in history that when you get exports, Chinese technology, that there are ways of building backdoors, and that we might not want to build ourselves into a dependence on the Chinese intelligence system. And so by sort of shutting off the spigot of intelligence from China, we may be creating a world where we're incentivizing the American labs in an even more extreme way to release open source models.
$3 in, $15 out, and open weights dropping next week. What do you think happens to closed model pricing after that date?
Well, the pricing debate is kind of interesting because if you look at the price of Kimi K3, it is violating the previous narrative of open source that it's going to be 10% of the price and 80% of the performance. This is actually 100% of the performance and sometimes above 100% of the performance of closed source models, but it is not 10% of the price. It's actually the same price as Sonnet. And so what we're seeing is that open source is becoming priced in the same way as mid-tier, middle-sized American models. And I think it will be interesting to see whether the price of inference actually does end up going down, or whether the size of these models and the complexity and difficulty of serving them means that just simply due to the cost of electricity, that we'll be paying a lot more for the most advanced intelligence.
If you're Anthropic or OpenAI watching this week, what's your move?
Well, you can already see what Anthropic's move is. Anthropic is increasing rate limits and giving more people access to Fable. Because why should somebody use Opus 4.8? It's not as good as model as Kimi K3 in many domains. And so what is happening is that the competitive pressure is improving the competitive offerings that Anthropic and OpenAI are giving to developers and users, which is what competition is supposed to do. So every consumer should be happy about this. They're getting better rate limits. They're getting better models. They're getting more and more stuff for free and more access through their paid plans.
So it was just 6 weeks from Fable to Kimi K3. How long before the leaderboard flips again?
Probably going to flip next week because there's always new releases happening. Anthropic, of course, is going to see this and, it's going to light a fire under them. Of course, they've been at the top of the leaderboards for almost the whole year. And so now being dethroned, even in an important area, is going to be incentivizing them to move faster and faster to the next release. It's absolutely an extraordinary competition and race, and it's only accelerating.